From Arab Spring to European fall, in parts of the Middle East they're making steps towards democracy, while this week in Europe, technocrats are replacing elected leaders. Does the rise of Lucas Papademos in Greece and Italy's Mario Monti suggest European democracy can't handle the pressure? Our diplomatic and economics editors are here with their take on a dramatic week in the Eurozone. Across the country, millions fell silent to mark Armistice Day. But is the remembrance poppy now a political symbol as much as a symbol of the fallen? We'll discuss if there's a better way to honour the dead, and we've excerpts from Siegfried Sassoon's newly unearthed poems.
The clouds your plume, the glittering sky a host of swords in harmony with the whole loveliness of light, flung forth to lead you through the fight.
Discuss further where the turmoil of this week might lead. I'm joined by the French-born journalist Nabila Ramdani, who covered the Arab Spring, by the Conservative MP Rory Stewart, who recently returned from a trip to Libya, and from Coventry by the Labour MP Gisela Stewart, who helped draw up the Lisbon Treaty. Hello to you all. Picking up straight away on the whole question of how this looks, funnily enough, from the three countries who are emerging into democracies.
Well, I think for these newly liberated countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and indeed Libya, they are way behind necessarily in their expressions of democracy, and in fact they're still trying to establish democracy. And the Tunisia model, they've staged elections recently. I think that gives us hope for the future of the region, but nothing more than that. As we know, gunmen, and not just the army, are still very much in charge of Egypt and indeed Libya. And the very Libyans are aware that their own revolution succeeded through the immense firepower of NATO, and it had nothing to do with
But looking now, Gisela, at how this all looks in Europe. It looks, funnily enough, of course, that democracy, certainly the way it's being exercised in Italy and Greece, simply isn't up to the task of the financial crisis that Europe finds itself in, or the global financial crisis.
Well, you're rather assuming that the structures within the European Union, and particularly in relation to the Eurozone, were democratic in the sense as we understand them, an ability to change your government if you no longer like what the current government does. The one thing we should never underestimate is the ability of genuine democracies to recover, and they've got resilience. But the deep malaise which we're seeing at the moment is a political elite of 17 countries, and particularly led by two big ones, holding on to a model that simply doesn't work. And the people who have to pay the price for that are those countries in the periphery, like Greece, Portugal and Spain, who are illiquid.
But the fact is that politics isn't up to the economics, if you want to put it that way, in these countries, and therefore putting in a technocrat essentially is an erosion of democracy.
It is, and it's an outrageous erosion of democracy. But the answer to this is to recognise that the 17 countries who are currently within the Eurozone are not economies that can function together. And if the politicians were really serious about resolving the problem, they would start by drawing up plans which would allow some countries to restore competitiveness, like Greece, and be allowed to leave the euro to do that.
On Europe first, before we turn to look at the Arab Spring, I mean, there is the possibility. I mean, obviously, you can make analogies to at the Arab Spring and say there's the domino effect. You could say in Europe we're not free of the domino effect in this crisis at all, are we?
No, and of course Italy is a much more serious threat in that way than Greece. But I think we're still in the first phase of things. There's still a very good chance at the moment that things can settle down and Europe can muddle through. Despite the fact European populations are really angry, by and large, the parties in Europe and the governments in Europe remain pro-European. And the populist Euroscepticism on the street isn't reflected in the government. So if it continues, if Italy's in crisis, something else may change. But at the moment, we're not there yet.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that, I mean, it looks as if politicians, in a way, are quite happy to sit back and let the technocrats take the hit and let the technocrats sort this out, which presumably is not a very good day for politics.
Well, my own view is that, the realities of global economics do not sit happily with democratic principles. I think it's clearly a time for technocrats to fix the economic system, to reassure the financial markets, and to make sure that the continent competes with growing economic powerhouses like China and India, for example. And on a purely practical level, I think it's quite impossible to organise elections at this time.
Yeah. But Gisela Stewart, the point is that what the electorate wants governments to do, the markets, the traders won't let them do. There's a huge disconnect here, isn't there? And it would seem that the people that call the shots in the markets end up with the upper hand.
I'm really quite shocked to hear an argument which says technocrats need to take over because times are so tough that we can't trust the people. It's exactly when times are tough that you need to trust the resilience and the ability to recover of democracies. And what got us into,
Gisela Stewart.
but hold on, because what got us into this trouble were the very technocrats who didn't face up to economic realities, who thought politicians could override markets. They caused the problem, and now they portray themselves to be the solution.
Right. I think this is a great opportunity for politicians because at the moment publics are divided. If you look at the Greek population, they don't want to leave the Eurozone. 80% of Greeks want to stay in the Eurozone, but 80% of Greeks don't want the reform package. That's the classic area for politicians because a technocrat on his own isn't going to be able to solve that conundrum.
But then the problem is, of course, the technocrat is having to solve the problems because neither the government in Italy nor the government in Greece was sufficient to the task, Rory.
Yes, and in the end, I don't believe that's sustainable. I agree with Gisela. That really where politicians need to explain to people what's happening. You need to eventually sit down with the Greek people and say, you can't have it both ways. We can't lurch from populism to technocracy. We need a consistent mission that you're going to sign up with. And although Papandreou's referendum in the end was crazy, you can understand the motivation of it, which is you've got to engage with the people.
But if you don't engage with the people, what happens? I mean, you can go back and look at Arab countries, and if you don't engage with the people, there's a huge amount of discontent, which then we've had foment in Spain, in Greece, all over Europe. We've had demonstrations, not obviously to the extent, Tahrir Square, for example. But where can discontent lead?
Well, I would disagree with Rory and Gisela. I think, the reality within the global system is that we are far more in the hands of the markets than in the hands of the politicians. And just like dictators in the Arab world, they realize that messages put across by Twitter and Facebook and the internet in general were far more important than their own messages. I think the global economy is very much in the hands of institutions, of the money people, and these people are far more influential than politicians.
Gisela Stewart, you just don't hold much influence anymore.
Politicians set the framework, and remember, democracy is the framework within which the people express their collective will. Politicians represent the people, and I really do think that we need to trust those democracies. And just come back, why is Greece in the trouble it is in? Because some politicians allowed Greece and assisted Greece by coming in and joining on the terms which were wrong, and everybody knew that. That's the root of the crisis. It's not democracy.
I'm not saying that we should not trust people, absolutely not. I'm saying that at a particular time when we're faced with a crisis, it is unwise to go to the country. And this idea that President Sarkozy can sort this whole mess out over dinner with Angela Merkel is absolutely ludicrous.
But where does this leave Britain then?
Well, I think Britain needs to be very careful. Wherever this is going, Britain's interests are the stability of our economy and the stability of Europe. And we need to try to help Europe to settle down. And we have to recognise that this isn't the moment to be talking about Britain's in and out. It's about stabilising the economy and helping Europe to stabilise. And it's also, just to come back to this conversation we're having, it can't be about bankers and technocrats weighing in to Greece and Italy, telling the people, because we've seen the IMF do that all over the world. It's a disaster. A backlash will follow. The people won't put up with it.
Well, we've seen it during the financial crisis in 2008. There was nominal anger at Gordon Brown's government, but the real outrage was really reserved at financial institutions and indeed banks who had gambled away the fortunes.
Thank you both. Thank you all very much, I should say.